Hello friends, I am going to talk to you about the poem Death of a Peasant written by R.S. Thomas. Now R.S. Thomas is a prominent poet of Wales, of modern Wales, and he was born in 1913 and he lived a full life up to the ripe old age of 87. He was a philanthropist. R.S. Thomas was ordained an Anglican priest and he spent most of his years in service in many small Welsh villages. And there he came to know, or he came to have a first-hand experience of the difficult lives of the Welsh people. Wales is a land of beauty, but it is also a land of harsh and rugged terrain. And R.S. Thomas, in his poetry, uses the same harshness and ruggedness of his land. He makes no attempts to soften the travails of his people. Instead, in a very direct, frank style, he writes about the day-to-day struggles that the people of Wales had to face. The struggles with poverty, the struggles with bad weather, the struggles with the lack of facilities, all that, the struggles of a people who had to fight with a barren land to eke out a living. Everything is portrayed so beautifully, so heart-rendingly in the poems of R.S. Thomas. Now the poem that I've taken here is this one titled Death of a Peasant. Most of his poems are about the peasants and the ordinary people and the life of that he saw around him. He has also written another very famous poem titled A Peasant, where you have a character called Iago Pritchard, and this Iago Pritchard appears in other poems of R.S. Thomas too. Now coming to this particular poem titled Death of a Peasant, it's a very short poem, and let me just read it to you first. This is how it begins. You remember Davis? He died, you know, with his face to the wall, as the manner is of the poor peasant in a stone croft on the Welsh hills. I recall the room under the slates and the smudged snow of the wide bed in which he lay, lonely as an ewe that is sick to lamb in the hard weather of mid-March. I remember also the trapped wind tearing the curtains and the wild light's frequent hysteria upon the floor. The bare floor without a rug or mat to soften the loud tread of neighbors crossing the uneasy boards to peer at Davis with the gruff words of meaningless comfort, before they turned heartless away from the stale smell of death in league with those dank walls. So that's the poem. And so he opens the poem without much ado. A very direct question, as though now he was the priest there and he knew almost everybody who lived in those villages where he worked. And so it's kind of like a conversation that he makes with one of his acquaintances in the village, and he just tells, you remember Davis? Yes, he died, you know, and he with his face to the wall, as is the manner of the poor peasant in a stone croft. So he says that he must have definitely gone there to meet Davis and to maybe perform the rites just before death and the rites after of the funeral too. And so he says that he died with his face to the wall. Now, facing the wall is an expression which means that you are in a situation where you do not have another option. You have reached a point where you cannot go onward. All your options are over. The road has come to an end. So facing the wall generally signifies defeat, And when you say that somebody is lying facing the wall, that means he has accepted, he has given up his fight, he has given up his struggle, and he has accepted his ignominy and defeat. So here, when he went to see Davis, Davis was lying dead with his face to the wall, as if he has nothing more to say to the world, as if he has admitted that he is a defeated man. And this part of the sentence is significant, as the manner is of the poor peasant in a stone croft on the Welsh hills. So he says this posture of lying with his face to the wall is not peculiar to this particular man called Davis alone. This is how most of the peasants are found when they lie, when they are dead, or in their dying hours. They usually turn to the wall, in the sense that the Welsh peasants are a troubled lot, people who have been suffering throughout their lives, people who have known no luxuries, no pleasures in their lives. And so that is why he says, this is not the only man who I have seen lying with his face to the wall. This is how most peasants are. They die as defeated beings, unable to accomplish any success in life. I recall the room under the slates and the smirched snow on the wide bed in which he lay. And so here again, the slates. Now, before that, there was this mention of the stone croft. A croft is a small farm which is enclosed within a stone wall, and the houses of the peasants, the poor dwellings of the peasants too, were built of slate stone, long strips of slate stone cut in order to build a house. So even the roofs were made of thin pieces of slate, and that is why he says, I recall the room under the slates. And so he remembers very vividly of how he went there to meet Davis, and Davis was lying there dead, and the room, he just looked around maybe the room, and he remembers it was a cold room under the slates. And Wales, of course, is a cold country which has long winters, and the smirched snow of the wide bed in which he lay. So smirched snow is supposed to be a symbol of purity. It is white, but here the smirched snow of the wide bed in which he lay, I guess, symbolizes that he was lying on a bed, a big bed, which was maybe too big for that little room, and it was the bed clothes must have been soiled or dirty, white bed clothes maybe, which were soiled, and that is why he calls it smirched snow. And as he lay there, when the poet saw him, or when the speaker saw him, he reminded him of a ewe that is sick to lamb, lonely as an ewe that is sick to lamb. So a ewe is a female sheep that is ready to give birth, and when it is time for a ewe to give birth, it moves away from the rest of the herd because it is very uneasy. It has begun to experience the difficulties and the pangs of childbirth, so it usually moves away from the crowd of the herd and chooses a quiet corner where it can lie down. So that is why when he saw the man lying there lonely on this wide bed turning towards the wall, he is reminded of the ewe. And again, that is a comparison, a simile taken from this rural kind of background, because this is a village and these are peasants and farmers and shepherds. So in their life, they are most closely associated with such things as sheep and lambs and uh, all such activities, and that is why maybe this is the picture that immediately comes to the poet's mind when he sees this lonely dead man. So lonely as an ewe that is sick to lamb. Sick to lamb. To lamb here means is preparing for the act of giving birth to lambs. Lambing. Okay. Sick to lamb means it is going through the difficulties of childbirth. I remember in the hard weather of mid-March. So in mid-March, the weather is quite tough. It's wet, and so here the animal is in trouble. It is having great difficulties. I remember also the trapped wind tearing the curtains. So he also remembers as he stood in that particular room, there were some curtains there, and the wind, those were maybe flimsy curtains, and in most cases the windows did not really have any glass panes to keep the wind out. The windows usually in such poor dwellings are just rectangles cut out in stone, and the only covering is a flimsy curtain. And so here the wind that has come in kind of was roaming around inside the room like a trapped animal, because it could not go out. It was tearing at the curtains in a wild and desperate attempt to escape from the stuffy room. So you can see how the wind is personified as a trapped animal. I remember also the trapped wind tearing the curtains and the wild light's frequent hysteria upon the floor. So that again is a beautiful way of putting it. So when the curtain moves with the wind, in the attempt of the wind to escape out of the room, it lifts and drops the curtains, and each time the curtain is lifted, the light comes in, and when the curtains fall, again there is a hysteria of light. So the wild light's frequent hysteria, it is the wildness of the wind, of the trapped wind, which has been transferred to this light, and so it creates hysteria on the floor. Hysteria is, when a person is troubled, when he is unable to restrain his emotions, when a person cries aloud or laughs aloud, you say that she is hysterical. And hysteria is generally associated with women, because they are the ones who give vent to their emotions, more violently and more frequently. So here the wild light draws hysterical designs upon the floor in keeping with the movement of the curtain. The bare floor with a rug, and upon the floor, and you can see how he joins one to the other. He spoke about the man, and then he spoke about he compared the man to the lamb, and then the lamb is connected to the harsh weather of March, and then the weather, the windy wet weather of March, is now connected to the trapped wind which tears at the curtains, and now the curtain is connected to the light, and now the light is connected to the floor. And then he talks about the floor, the bare floor without a rug or mat to soften the loud tread of neighbors crossing the uneasy boards, to peer at Davis with gruff words. And so it is a poor man's home. There is no carpet, there is no rug. So when the neighbors walk in and out, because they know that this man is dying, so they come to pay their last visit to this dying man, maybe a friend, a good neighbor. So they come in, and when they walk in with their boots across these uneasy boards, the creaky boards, the wooden boards of the floor, because there are no mats, the sound is grating. It sounds like a loud tread of neighbors, disturbing sounds crossing the uneasy boards. uneasy boards. Again, it is not the board that is uneasy, but it is the people, the people who walk in and out of the room, they are uneasy because they can sense the presence of death in that room. So this is an example again of a transferred epithet, where the uneasiness of the visitors is transferred to the boards on the floor. So the neighbors move in and out, and there is no rug to soften the sound of their feet. To peer at Davis. And what do these people do? They come to Davis, maybe even before he died, they came to him. They tried to murmur some words of consolation, but they turn out to be gruff words of meaningless comfort, because nothing is there that can comfort Davis, and he was awaiting death. And that is why gruff words of meaningless comfort, they kind of mumble something, not knowing what to tell a dying man. So all those noises, so he remembers, and I think that maybe the poet visited the man when he was even before his death and even after his death, and so when he went there, he saw people coming in, peering, going and taking a look at Davis, trying to comfort him with their meaningless words, before they turned heartless away from the stale smell of death in league with those dank walls. And after some time, after a perfunctory mumbling of meaningless words, they just turned away. Heartless, he says, because nobody really wants to stay back with a man who's dying, because the stale smell of death they could feel inside that room. So everybody who comes in wanted to immediately run away from there. So they turn away from him. They know that he is not going to come back, and they move away from him, because they also know that nothing they do or say is going to offer any kind of comfort to him or bring him back from death. So they turn heartless away from the stale smell of death in league with those dank walls. Now turning heartless away again also tells us that death due to poverty, death due to misery is not an uncommon thing in places like this, where peasants suffer from so much of privation, and when the hostile weather often destroys their crops, people falling sick and starving to death and finally surrendering themselves to death is not a new thing. And that is why they are heartless, because they are not really affected by this. This is something that happens almost on a daily basis in those parts of the world. And so they turn heartless away from the stale smell of death, and again the stale smell of that stuffy room which doesn't have proper ventilation, where a dead man or maybe a dying man had been lying for a few days. So the smell of sickness, the smell of stale clothes, smirched bedclothes, all that together. So nobody wants to stay there for long. They move away from there. They turn heartless away from the stale smell of death in league with those dank walls. And the smell of death is in league, or it has joined hands with those dank walls, dank, moist, walls that have not been plastered, walls that have not succeeded in keeping out the cold, the wet walls. So the smell of death, it mingles with the smell of the wet walls, and together they create a very unwelcoming atmosphere in that room. And so all the visitors, they immediately leave the room, because they can smell both the dank walls and death. So that is a poem that brings out all the misery of the poor farmers and peasants of Wales. And you have a wonderful entry on R.S. Thomas and his poetry in the site Poetry Foundation, and that is one site I always rely on when I try to do some research on a poet or a poem. My first choice is always the Poetry Foundation, and this time too the site has not failed me, and there are some very some great insights that the site offers to the reader about R.S. Thomas and about his poetry. And it says here that many of Thomas's poems set his farming characters against the bleak and forbidding landscape of Wales, focusing on the difficulties of rural existence. Many of his poems offer an unsparingly bleak view of man. So that is what you see again in this poem about the struggle and their final succumbing to death.